I got 2 bits of advice in Scituate that lasted me my whole life. In fact, I've passed them on to my sons, and I intend to pass them on to the grandkids. But Morty used to say, "You're no better than anyone, and no one's better than you. So don't take any guff from anyone." And that, I just, he told me that when I was probably 14.
Yeah.
But I made that kind of the centerpiece of my style. It really resonated with me. That, you are no better than anybody else, but nobody's better than you. So treat people with respect. And I always did that.
That was George Casey, 4-star general in the U.S. Army, sharing advice his grandfather gave him when George was a boy, that he's carried with him throughout his 41-year career in the military and still carries with him today. General Casey was an American soldier for the majority of his life, eventually leading from 2007 to 2011 as Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, which at 1.1 million people is arguably the world's largest and most complex organization. He's widely credited with restoring balance to the Army during one of the most unusual periods in political and military history, and also in leading efforts to keep the Army relevant in the 21st century. His commitment did not stop there. He is on the board of directors of a number of veteran services groups, continuing to be a leading advocate for military families, wounded soldiers, and survivors of the fallen. He's been known for his integrity and his candor and his humor throughout his life. He's now a teacher at Cornell's Graduate School of Management and the University of Denver School of International Studies, from which he holds a master's degree. And he also lectures to leaders at companies like Caterpillar, Coca-Cola, and General Electric. George is my father's cousin, so I was lucky enough to be able to sit down with him recently to record this conversation. And it was very humbling. It's difficult for me, having never served in the military, to imagine the sacrifice that such a commitment requires. So talking to George about his life and everything he has accomplished in the name of service was an honor, for which I'm very grateful and happy to share. So thank you, George, and thank you to all of the men and women who have served this great country, and thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoy. Thank you for doing this.
No problem. It's good.
Pleasure to have you on the show. For narrative's sake, I thought it would be interesting to have you talk a little bit about growing up in a military family and your background.
Yeah, okay. So I was born in Japan in 1948. My dad was in the Army. He was a member of the occupation force. He was with the 11th Airborne Division in Sendai, Japan. We came home a few months after I was born, and that began the life of an Army brat. And my dad moved all around the United States. Had a tour in Germany where I went to the American high school on the American base there, and the next year my brother and I went to a boarding school in Rome, and then came back to the States. So I wound up going to 4 high schools in 3 countries. I graduated from Boston College High School here in 1966, and then went off to Georgetown. We were engaged in Vietnam significantly at that time, and I signed up for ROTC, Reserve Officer Training Corps. And my dad had been in the military. I'd lived in the military all my life, and the country was at war, and so I figured it was my duty to serve. So I had a big discussion with my dad, because when I graduated from high school, I wanted to go in the military and as an enlisted guy and become a Special Forces Green Beret.
And skip college.
And skip college, but put it off. And my dad convinced me that my best shot was probably to go to college and go in as an officer. And so that's what I did. I went in and took ROTC and got commissioned in 1970, the day before I graduated, and fully expecting to go off to Vietnam. But Vietnam started to wind down. I got assigned to Germany, not Vietnam, for my first assignment, and I was supposed to be in Germany for a year and then 18 months, and then the war was over. So I never wound up going to Vietnam. And in some cases, some sense, I wonder to myself, go back and forth with myself about whether I should have gone after my dad had been killed. My dad was killed about a month after I graduated in Vietnam in a helicopter crash, and I can't say that soured me on the war, but I was still prepared to do my duty, but I wasn't as fired up to go as I might have been before he was killed. My original plan was to stay in the Army to do my 2-year ROTC obligation and get out and go to law school. That's what I told my bride. And she reminds me that after 41 years that my sense of time is not necessarily the same as hers. I went in and went through my training, and it's interesting. One of the things I ask myself all the time is, if my dad had lived, would I have stayed in the Army? And it may seem counterintuitive, but it was easier to stay in when he wasn't there than if he was. And I would have felt if he was a 2-star general when he died, people said he was moving up, and to be a second lieutenant while your dad is one of the top generals in the Army, I'm not sure I would have liked that. So yeah. I don't know if I would have stayed or not. But anyway,
interesting.
I got in there, got to my first unit, and actually I found out I could lead, and I didn't know that going in. But it's one of those things that I'll just never forget. I was assigned this platoon platoons of about 30 folks. Because of the Vietnam War going on, Germany was a second priority, so we had about half that many people in the platoon. And it was a tough time there. The discipline was bad. There was drugs. People were coming back from Vietnam with post-traumatic stress, which led to alcohol problems. And it's interesting. At the time, we didn't know it was post-traumatic stress. We just saw the alcohol problem. So I took this band of ne'er-do-wells, and we had this big inspection where they inspected every platoon in the battalion, so all of your vehicles and all of your equipment and everything. And as the inspector walked through my platoon, after we'd worked probably very hard for about 10 days, I mean, really, looking back, it was really silly stuff, but we worked very hard at it. And the inspector turned to me and said, "Lieutenant, this is the best platoon we've seen in the whole battalion." And the guys they were so keyed up because they'd worked so hard. I was in the hallway, they were in their rooms, but they'd left. They were supposed to be standing at attention beside their bunks, but they were all leaning by the door. And when they heard this, they all came jumping into the hall and cheering and everything. And I said, "Wow, that was, kind of said, wow, there's something like this." And I realized that every one of those guys, not in Germany, but they could depend on me for their lives. And I vowed never to let my subordinates down. And that's something that drove me the whole time I was in the military. I always tried to do the right thing for the people, but at the same time accomplish the mission.
Yeah. And when you were just starting out as a younger person, of the leaders that you were inspired by, that you felt connected to, what were they doing? Was it certain personality traits or behavior?
It was really interesting, and this is a bit of an anomaly, because when my dad was killed, people wrote me letters, came up to me on the street and said, "I served with your dad. He was a wonderful man. He was this, he was that. He was a soldier," and all this stuff. And I had this idealized picture of my dad and what it was to be a great leader. And I wasn't thinking about this at the time. I've only thought about it retrospectively. But as I looked at all these other leaders, none of them measured up. And so I wasn't really inspired. I was inspired by one company commander and one battalion commander. So a company commander is in charge of about 150 people. A battalion commander is in charge of about 1,000 people. And I probably had 5 or 6 company and 5 or 6 battalion commanders in the first 3.5 years I was in Europe. So two leaders inspired me. One was a former enlisted soldier who got in a battlefield commission, and he was a great motivator, and he knew how to push people's buttons and get them fired up to go out and do things. And I really learned a lot from him about motivating. And he was an upbeat guy, and he knew how to have fun while he was getting the job done. And he really, it was terrific working for him. And that was one of the things I followed and said, okay, I want to be an upbeat leader.
Yeah. So the energy you're bringing.
Yeah.
That's the main thing that was motivating you.
It was the energy. It was the optimism.
Yep.
But it was you worked your ass off.
Yeah.
You know, and you didn't want to let him down. And so that was probably the first lesson. And then this other guy, I was ready to get out of the Army. And my wife and I had all these 5 other battalion commanders and their wives who were just idiots. And I'm saying, man, this is not what I came out to. And then we get this guy, Woodla Hardy and his wife. And he was a low-key, accent the positive kind of guy. And he wasn't really a hard-charging warrior. I mean, he was fit and he was capable. But he knew how to give broad guidance and allow people to exceed it. And so he had a hand-picked group of us, and he kind of gave us broad direction and let us go, and just kind of like the sheepdog, just kind of kept us going in the same direction.
So he's giving you autonomy.
Yeah, and so he was the second guy that I really thought was a great leader. The other guy, and I skipped this this is when I was in college, and I worked for the Redskins, and I worked for Vince Lombardi for a year. And I mean, he was the most effective natural leader that I had ever seen. And what I learned from Vince was that you set high standards. You figure out what the most important elements of your success are. You know, for him, it was basics. It was blocking. It was tackling. It was execution.
So the component parts.
The component part. I mean, but you know, you can take any problem, any job, and break it down into so many parts. You can't do everything well.
Right.
And it's a real mental exercise for the leader to sit down and find the essence of success, and then to focus all of the organization's efforts on being the best at those 1, 2, or maybe 3 things. And he did that very well. I mean, they ran the power sweep was their best play, and they ran it 1,200-1,300 times a season against every possible defense. And he'd sit there at practice and he'd say, "Run it again, run it again." and I learned a lot from that. And I probably didn't think about this until I started looking back and thinking about my leadership style. But every place I went, I said, okay, what is it we have to do to be the best? And then I want to be the best at these 3 or 4 things. And that kind of propelled me all the way. I did that at every level of command and in varying different ways. Sure.
So you'd enter into the situation and kind of have a bird's eye view of what was going on, and then you would convey that message to your...
it's more than a bird's eye view. And this, I've kind of expanded on this in my teaching at Cornell.
Yeah.
If you ever read the book Great by Choice by Jim Collins, he looks at 20+ thousand companies between 1990, over a decade, from the early 90s to the early 2000s. And he looks at the companies that outperformed the industry by 10 times during that period. Out of 20,000, how many do you think there were? 7.
I was going to say 10.
7, yeah.
7?
7. And it's the Microsoft, it's the Amgens, it's the Progressives, it's the Southwest Airlines, Stryker Biotech, those, and every one of those things, the leader analyzed his operational environment and figured out the essence, and they held the company to meeting a specific goal. I've never been able to get it to 1.
Yeah.
But Progressive, and I won't get the terms right on this, but Progressive in the insurance business, if you're going to be profitable, you have to have 90% of the revenues that you take in has to go toward paying the claims and the administration. So you have a 4% profit margin. And that's what he focused everybody on, 96%. And if you didn't get 96%, then you got, and if you didn't meet your portion of that, then he gave you what they call the snorkel award. The snorkel meaning you were underwater, so you needed to snorkel to breathe. And you got to hang that on your wall. And then they had the breakfast with the boss, and if you met your goals, you were a part of that group, but if you weren't, it was another nice breakfast, but you weren't there with the boss.
Yeah.
And then if you missed your goals 2 years in a row, then he came down and helped you. But it was all focused around that 96%. I forget what they call it.
So it's something to do with clarifying your purpose.
Focus, yeah.
Your focus and your main goal,
Yeah.
your main objective.
Yeah. And it's especially important today, and I talk a lot about VUCA, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I use that to describe the environment that I was in Iraq, that I saw as Chief of Staff of the Army, and that people in the business world see today.
Volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous.
And ambiguous, yeah. And what happens is people get flummoxed by the volatility, the uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity, and the interaction that all those things bring on you. Mm-hmm. And so they don't make decisions, they don't act, or they try to do everything. And when you try to do everything, you do nothing. So this whole notion of focus and forcing yourself as the leader to say, no, to do your homework,
yeah.
to bore deeply into the problem, to find the essence of it and say, no, I'm staking my time on this, that we're going to do these 3 things, and that's going to make us, give us the success that we want.
And do you have any methods for improving your focus or practicing your focus?
I have a thing I call the VUCA Index, and it's an online survey that we can give to people in a company. We usually suggest 3 or 4 levels of leadership down in the company, and there's 9 or 10 quantitative questions, where you just answer, and then there's a couple of qualitative questions in each: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And what it does is it gives the leader a view of his operating environment and where the volatility is coming from, where the uncertainty is coming from, where the complexity and where the ambiguity is coming from. And it's interesting because it comes from internal and external sources. And I would have expected that that primarily it came from external sources. Well, I gave it to these guys. They were all senior executives in Australia, in the state of Victoria, and I gave them a trial run on the thing, and I was amazed how much internal VUCA there was. It wasn't higher than external, but it was almost equal. And what these guys said was basically they spend an awful lot of their time focused on people problems, recruiting people, and a lot of internal systems, changes in technology. They spend an awful lot of time inside. And one of the most important things I tell senior folks as they get up is the higher you go, the more the keys to your success lie outside the organization rather than inside the organization. And so if you're spending all your time inside fixing problems, you're missing, you're going to miss it. People are going to run right by you.
And then what about your teammates, people that are in your own group? What sort of traits stand out from your experience of people who are supportive and motivating people to work with?
The really nice thing about the Army is 98% of the people are really team players. They're committed to the institution, they're committed to the organization, and they're not worried about themselves. So I was kind of spoiled. And you want folks that will listen, give you real credible feedback, disagree with you, but when you say this is what we're going to do, then they put their heart and soul into making it happen. And well, I tell you what, like I said, I was spoiled in the Army. There's not many people that aren't that way, and that's a good thing.
And do you have, either to your students or during your career in the Army, for the younger people that you're working with, or even people that I guess that you're not working with, advice, sort of any general advice to younger people that are just starting out in their careers for how they can be effective?
Yeah. Your leadership style evolves as you get more and more responsibility, or it doesn't. For successful leaders, their leadership style evolves. I wasn't the same leader as a 4-star general as I was as a second lieutenant. And so when I look at young folks that are starting out, I say courage, commitment, candor, and competence. Those are the 4 things that I look for in young folks.
Courage, candor,
commitment, candor, and competence. The courage to act in the face of uncertainty and risk, to make a decision. Commitment. I look for folks that are committed to something larger than themselves. They're committed to the goal of the organization. And now part of that is the leader's job to build a team, and you build the team around commitment to a common goal. Yeah. But you got to commit to, it's got to be about more than you. Mm-hmm. And I spent a lot of time in my class talking about team and the importance of building a team. And you got to commit to that team, because the team beats individuals every time. Candor. At a young age, and a leader, you have to be candid about your own strengths and your own weaknesses. Yeah. And I tell the young officers this all the time. He said, you might as well be candid because everybody else sees it. Yeah. And I remember my first platoon. I said, I screwed that up. I got to tell them. And he said, oh, no, you can't tell them. You can't tell them you're wrong, Lieutenant. I said, what do you mean? They all know. Yeah. I'm not. Yeah. And I'd say, hey, I screwed that up. Yeah. And they go, yeah, we know. but
that goes a long way.
It builds trust. As you grow, it becomes about integrity and about character. But it's the same thing. And candor builds trust, and trust is the glue that holds the organization together. Yeah. And then competence. As a young person starting out, the best thing you can do is be really good at whatever it is you're doing, mm-hmm. and get good fast, because that's how you make a name for yourself and a reputation for yourself, and get put in a leadership position. For these young lieutenants, they come in and they walk up, and there's this tank, 70 tons, hydraulic systems, gunnery. I mean, it's just it, and they got to understand that the automotive system, the gun system, they got to know how to maintain it. They got to learn all that stuff. Yeah. And what I found was, until my young officers were comfortable that they were technically and tactically competent, they didn't have the confidence. They didn't radiate the confidence that it takes to lead. Right. So that's the courage, commitment, candor, and confidence at a young age. That's kind of where I start. On the other end of the spectrum, people always ask me, what did I look for when I chose generals to help me lead the Army? And I said, vision, courage, and character. And those to me at the high, when you're leading an organization, doesn't have to be an organization of 1 million people like the Army, but any organization, it's when it's 10 people. The number one responsibility of a leader is to point the way ahead, and that takes vision. And that's vision is the ability to see around corners and to see something significant about the future that's not readily apparent to others. And to do that, you have to have done your deep dive and your focus, so you know your environment better than anybody else in the organization. And you're the one that you always have the outside context that people inside the organization don't have. You have the broader view. So it's incumbent on you to say, this is the way we're going.
Yeah.
And this is what we're going to do. And to do that in the VUCA world, which is what we live in, takes courage.
Yeah.
Because you could be wrong, and there could be significant consequences. So it takes courage to act in the face of uncertainty and risk. But you have to act to succeed.
Yeah. And you mentioned character too. Is that something
That's the third one, yeah.
Is it something that you can just notice, or you can feel, or is it something that you've kind of gleaned from experience with that person?
You kind of watch people and you get a sense.
Yeah.
But you really can't measure the character of a person until they're squeezed. And it's how they act under pressure that lets you know this person's going to be okay, or they're not. And I had almost every general in the Army served for me in Iraq, and some of them were okay and some of them weren't.
Yeah. And what was a sign that they'd be okay? If they stayed calm, if they stayed in control?
If they stayed calm and they did what was right for the organization rather than themselves.
Yeah.
And a lot of times people get in when something bad happens. People get into covering their ass. I had a 2-star general in Iraq. Had something bad happen. And one of the things you have to learn as a leader, that bad stuff happens in good organizations all the time. And the fact that the bad things happen, that's not a surprise to anybody. Well, what happens is if you don't deal with it, it's worse. So he says to me, well, we're going to kind of keep this within the division because, it would be bad for the reputation of the division if this got out. And I said, this is already out. And if you're not going to investigate it fully, I'm going to investigate it. But it has to be investigated and action has to be taken. And when people start thinking that it wasn't the division, it was him.
Yeah.
This guy was, in Iraq and this bad thing happened and it reflected on him. And I kind of, Tom was off my list,
Yeah. It comes back to candor.
Yeah, but that's character. That's character. It's interesting, Theodore Roosevelt talks about character as the indispensable requisite for the country and for the individual. And I think it's true, but we have great discussions at Cornell is, wait a minute, was Hitler a good leader? Was he a man of character? I said, well, no, not exactly, no. He was an effective leader. He wasn't necessarily a good leader. And people, look at President Clinton. I was on a trip to Bosnia with this woman who did the vetting for the first Clinton administration. So anybody who wanted a big appointment, a secretary or deputy secretary position in one of the cabinet positions, she screened them. And we were talking, it was right after the thing with Monica Lewinsky came out. It was right after he had called his whole cabinet into the Roosevelt room where the cabinet meets. And he said, he told them that he didn't have sex with her. And they went out and they went on, they defended him. And I said to her, I couldn't look my subordinates in the eye if I had asked them, if I had told them that, if I'd lied to them. I couldn't look them in the face again. And she said, what she said to me? She said, they all owed everything they had to him because he put them in that position. And I said, wow, we're not going to agree on that. So people can be successful as leaders, but in the end it catches up with them. And character, like candor, is the glue that binds the organization together. People trust leaders of character because they know they'll do the right things in difficult circumstances. They'll do what's right for the organization rather than what's right for themselves.
Right, and they don't hold themselves on a pedestal in comparison to their people. And speaking of that, I'm very interested in this idea of, at a certain level, you can only control how you behave. That's one thing that's in your direct control. And so this idea of holding yourself to a higher standard. And in your book, you mention towards the end, sustaining yourself, that whole section, about reading and exercise and sleep and thinking and the importance also of writing and clarifying your thoughts. All of that really resonated with me because it sounds so simple, but I don't think that it is simple because it doesn't seem like all of us are doing it as much as we should be. Can you expand on that a little bit about how those things have played a role in your progress?
Yeah. One of the things that I thought you were going a little different direction. I'll come back to that. But one of the things that I talk about when I talk about VUCA is that to be a successful leader in this volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous environment, you have to accept what I call the VUCA paradox. And that is, you accept the fact that your operations, your environment's going to be volatile, uncertain, and it's all going to be changing. But you don't accept the fact that that will determine your results. You impose your will on the environment, and that's how you're successful.
Yeah.
And you're not going to be successful every time, but you're going to make mistakes, and you're going to learn from the mistakes, and you're going to get better. Mm-hmm. But you got a much better chance of succeeding if you focus.
Yeah. If you focus on the solution rather than on the problem.
On all the different problems. Right. Now, Jim Collins calls it the control-non-control paradox. I call it the VUCA paradox. That's what he said. That's what.
And what was the book you mentioned earlier? That
Great by Choice.
Great by Choice. Thanks.
Yeah.
Take a look at that.
I started talking to my colonels who were going into Kosovo, and for us, the American Army, the first 30 years of my career, I was training to fight the Russians. And now all of a sudden we're thrust into these peacekeeping operations in the Balkans, and it was a new environment to us. Mm-hmm. And we hadn't really prepared for that, so we were still learning. So I had all these guys going into these strange environments for the first time. And so I learned myself from my time in Bosnia as a brigadier that I had to make myself stick to a schedule where I got a reasonable amount of sleep every night, that I exercised 4 or 5 times a week, that I had quiet time every day to think, and that I would read myself to sleep every night. But I started thinking about those things, and I put it into the little acronym: rest, read, exercise, sleep, and think. And I told every leader, every battalion, brigade commander. So again, 1,000 troops and 3,000 troops. That's what they needed to do if they were going to be successful. Because I watched these guys. I mean, I'd go back to Germany and then come back down and visit them a month later, and they just look tired and worn out. And I look in their eyes.
Yeah.
And I can look in their eyes. I can say, this guy's sharp or he's foggy. And when I got into Iraq, I started talking to all the leaders about that. And I'd make them come through. Within 30 days, I talked to every group that came into Iraq, and I'd tell all the leaders, hey, read, exercise, sleep, and think. And I go around and visit them about 30 days later, and the sergeants major were always good. They'd come up to me and they'd pull on my sleeve and they'd say, General, the colonel's not doing what you said. And I'd look at the colonel and tell him he's running himself down. I'd say, hey, you're not going to make it a year, man. And you're doing your soul. That's how I got to them. Because they thought they were pushing themselves hard for the soldiers. And I said, hey, you're doing your soldiers a disservice because you're not going to be thinking as clearly as you need to be to solve the problems that they're doing. And then that you'd see.
So yeah, it's hammering home the idea that these small things you have to do consistently to expect to have any kind of long-term progress.
But in the business school up there at Cornell, I say, hey, if you guys aren't on some kind of exercise regimen, it doesn't have to be 4 or 5 days. It could be 2 or 3 days a week.
Yeah.
If you're not doing something now, it gets a hell of a lot harder to do when you're 40.
And have you maintained that now? You're out of the...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I did 4 or 5 days a week in Iraq. I did 4 or 5 days a week as Army Chief of Staff. I usually get 5 or 6 now.
And do you still actively read and write?
I read. I read a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
I don't read a lot of books. Probably read a dozen books a year. But
That's pretty good.
Yeah. But I read Economist,
Sure.
Wall Street Journal, Washington Post. I try to stay. I got 2 things I try to stay up to speed on. I stay up to speed on the international environment, which is, there's so much going on there that it's hard to stay abreast. And then leadership. I try to stay up to speed on that.
And what do you read for that, for leadership?
I read articles in the journal, in the Post, and then for my class, I'm continually going through. I have access to the Harvard Business School publications.
Oh, sure.
So I go through those things all the time, reading
That's
those
great.
things. Yeah.
What drew you to education as a second career, as a teacher? Was it a natural progression? Is that something that you always wanted to do?
It's interesting. People are surprised when I say this, but from the time I was a lieutenant colonel, so after about 17 years of service, you're always teaching.
Yeah.
You go into a job, you inherit a staff, you got to train the staff, you're teaching them, and every level you go to, you're teaching people because you're the most experienced person in the organization. Mm-hmm. And so you have to bring them along. So you're always teaching, and I enjoy it. And as I looked around and say, what am I really passionate about? And I looked at a lot of different things, and nothing really fired me up. But sharing lessons about leadership with young people, that fires me up. I enjoy that.
Yeah.
And I taught leader development myself at every level of command, from lieutenant colonel, 2-star general, and when I was the chief of staff of the Army. My guys calculated I spent 15% of my time teaching leader development stuff to generals. And it's that important. And so I enjoy doing that. I'm not bad at it. And I got a few good stories to make my points. And it's my opportunity to give back doing something I like. And it was an easy move. Is
there anything, other than what we've talked about so far, what are some of the basic fundamentals that you try to convey to your students? What do you try to bring out of them? What do you try to make them realize, in the first few days?
So I start off with leadership characteristics. I put up some slides about how different people define leadership. And I go through that and I say, okay, well, what do you take from that definition? We kind of come up a list of character traits that people think are important for leaders. So we get this, and then I have them break into some small groups, and figure out, okay, which of those, that list, or each group pick 3 that they think are the most important, and we kind of go through all that. And the point of that whole exercise is, look, there's this huge list of leadership characteristics and traits that people talk about and write about. You're never going to have all of them. Don't even try. What you have to do is be self-aware enough to understand where your strengths are and where your weaknesses are. And you have to figure out, are these weaknesses significant enough to invest your time in improving? Because it's going to take you more time to improve a weakness than it is to expand a strength. Nobody's perfect. Your leadership style is going to be your leadership style, and it begins with knowing who you are and what your strengths are and what your weaknesses are.
Yeah.
And then knowing how other people see you. And they have my class is part of a program, a leadership program they have at Cornell. So they have 360s and all that stuff.
Yeah.
So they get feedback from a lot of different sources.
Sort of peer assessments and things like that.
Yeah. So that's kind of the first part. Then I do this thing on the environment. And I do the VUCA environment, and I get them to think about their operating environment. And I break it down into internal, external, competition, and what I call sphere of influence. And what I've been amazed at in the businesses that I'm on the boards of and I've worked with, and consulting is how shoddily people look at their operating environment. I mean, I have to ask at board meetings, can you show me some benchmarks about where we stand against the other companies in our industry? Maybe pick 5 or 6 areas that are important, and let's see how we stack up. Well, when they're not showing you that, it ain't good. I mean, the reason they're not showing you is they know it's not good.
Yeah.
But you have to understand your competition, and the thing about sphere of influence. What I talk about is the higher you go, the more the keys to success lie outside your organization. So every time I went into a new position, I'd sit down and say, okay, now, who are the people outside my organization that I need to interact with for information, for intelligence, and to influence? And then I would set up a schedule where I would build a relationship with this person. And it might be a quarterly lunch. Mm-hmm. It might be a weekly meeting, depending on what I needed. And so what people don't appreciate is that when you get to be those, like, chief of staff of the Army, and I wanted to do something, I needed $2 billion from the Secretary of Defense. Well, you just don't send a note to the Secretary of Defense and say, hey, Mr. Secretary, we send me $2 billion. So it took me 3 months to go around and to explain to his staff, his key staff, about why I needed the money, why I needed their support to do that, and then get my other service chiefs, the Air Force, the Navy, and the Marines, because the money was going to come from them, and then I finally put all that together, and then I took it to the Secretary. And the old day, you never go to a decision meeting without knowing what the outcome's going to be. If you haven't set the conditions for the outcome you want before you go in there, you might as well not have the meeting. So anyway, that's why understanding that environment is important. And the external and internal is, the external is regulatory things that can affect you, legislative things that can affect you. And internal is all the personnel stuff, and your own lack of vision or whatever, things like that. So I talk about the environment and how they need to understand that environment if they're gonna find the essence, and that's kind of the end of that first session. And then I talk about the four key areas where senior leaders need to spend their time to be successful in a VUCA environment, and that's developing vision and strategy, building the team to execute the vision and strategy, setting the conditions to execute the vision and strategy, and preparing for the future. And I talk a little bit about how to do all those things. And then the last class is on character. Mm-hmm. And I have them read Aristotle.
What's that?
I have them read Aristotle.
Oh, really?
It's very good. Nicomachean and Ethics, chapter 2. And he's writing in 350 BC. But it's as relevant today. And the most important thing I try to get across to him is, look, nobody's perfect. And what Aristotle says is moral goodness is the result of habit. If you habitually do good things, good acts, you'll be a good person. If you go down the slippery slope the other way, you won't be a good person. And he says that moral goodness is a constant struggle to find the mean between excess and deficiency. And what he means is, for example, courage. Courage is the mean between cowardice and rashness. And so between rashness and cowardice, there's a lot of gray area. And that's where you want to be. You don't want to be on one extreme or the other. You want to be close to the mean. But there's no right answer to every situation. And he says, this is amazing to me. He says, you will never act in the right way, at the right time, toward the right person, with the right thing. You'll never do that. And when I read that, all I could think of was all the meetings I've walked out of saying, God, I wish I said this.
Yeah.
You just won't.
Is there anything else you recommend that they read?
That's really good on character.
Yeah.
I have them read the first 9 pages of the Army Leadership Manual, and then I have to read Walter Isaacson's article about Steve Jobs. And you say, okay, then we talk about, okay, what's the difference here?
Yeah.
And it's really amazing to me how many of the young folks couldn't imagine working for Steve Jobs. I mean, the vast majority wouldn't want to work for him. And I said, here's a guy who changed the world. And he made the people that work for him better and world changers. You sure? Yeah. We don't want anyone to call us an asshole in the meeting.
Yeah.
You asshole, he used to say that. You asshole, you never did anything right. It's interesting to me. I mean, nobody likes that.
Right. But he did have a way of raising people up that were willing to kind of hop on.
Yeah, he did.
On his wagon.
Well, he hired A players, and he didn't. If you weren't an A player, he didn't suffer you lightly.
Yeah.
I haven't read Sun Tzu, 3 chapters of Sun Tzu for the strategy class.
The Art of War.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, chapters 1 to 3. That really gets good about knowing you have to. The successful general knows himself and knows his enemy.
Yeah.
100 battles without peril, if you know that,
Yeah. And for knowing yourself, this idea of reflection.
It means knowing the organization, not just yourself.
Not just yourself, yeah.
But
And do you teach anything from Lombardi?
I do. He's the team building guy.
Yeah. What did he do? What did you observe him doing that other than his ability to break it down to the essence as a personality?
He was passionate.
Passion.
He was passionate and he was committed. I mean, can you imagine you walk in the first meeting he has with the Green Bay Packers, when he walks in there, he looks at these guys who are just 2-11, and he says, "It's my job to make you the best football player that I can make you, and I'm committed to doing that with every fiber of my being."
Yeah.
And he's just, his face. And if you've not read David Marinus's book, When Pride Still Mattered, it's very good.
I haven't. I will.
There's the story about the Ice Bowl was in there and what they do, and I use that example all the time.
Great.
But he was so passionate, so committed. He thought about the most important things. He got very good at the most important things, and he was a motivator, positively and negatively. So and I learned this the hard way. So here I'm 18 years old. I'm working for the Redskins. Lombardi comes in. I guess I'm probably closer to 20. So Lombardi comes in, and he's going to turn the Redskins around. Edward Bennett Williams hired him out of retirement to coach the Redskins and turn him into a winner, because they'd had 20 losing seasons up to that. So we go down to go to Tampa to play our first exhibition game against the Lions. And we lose 10-7. And so everybody kind of trudges back to the locker room, and I can't wait to hear what the coach is going to say to the team. But they come up to me and they say, "Casey, the coach wants you to stand outside, or keep everybody out of the locker room until he's finished talking to the team." So I said, "Okay." So I look in there, and what I should have done is gone outside the door and stood on the outside and not let anybody in. But I wanted to hear what he was saying.
Of course.
So I stood on the inside of the door. And so he's here, and the team is in the locker room over here. And he's ripping their lips. Yeah. All of a sudden, some sheriff's deputy opens the door, because there was a player beside me who was needed an ambulance ride to the airport. And the door was open. I closed it immediately. He stops in the middle of chewing out the team, and he turns to me, and he wastes me. I still to this day have no idea what he said. All I heard was yeah da 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 yeah da 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 da, and he, without missing a beat, he goes right back to chewing out the team.
Yeah.
I mean, the man has wasted me in front of the team. So we pick our stuff up, we get back on the plane, and we're flying home. And now I look up, and now he's coming down the aisle. He's got this big toothy grin, and he's patting everybody on the back. And he's building them back up again.
Yeah.
And I see him coming. I put my head down in my book, and I'm reading and reading. And I hear this, I look up, and there he's looking down at me with this big toothy grin. He goes, kind of hard on your back there, wasn't I, son? And he walks off. Well, now I'm on top of the plane, because the man thought enough of me to say something to me.
Yeah.
And the lesson I learned from that is whenever I had to choose somebody out or counsel somebody, I always left them with hope. And that was a great lesson for me. But that's kind of how he motivated people. And he never wanted to let them, because he was so committed and so passionate about winning that you wanted to do everything you could to be part of that. Oh, and he was big on character. Big on character.
Yeah.
He one of his quotes about character is, "You alone are responsible for your character. It's nobody else's responsibility but yours to make sure that you're a man or woman of good character."
And that comes down to any decision that you make as your own.
Yeah.
And what about before, we can wrap up soon, but just curious about your kind of your self-motivation going into any kind of new promotion or uncertain situation. How did you get yourself up for it?
I got 2 bits of advice in Scituate that lasted me my whole life. In fact, I've passed them on to my sons, and I intend to pass them on to the grandkids. But Morty used to say, "You're no better than anyone, and no one's better than you. So don't take any guff from anyone." And that, I just, he told me that when I was probably 14.
Yeah.
But I made that kind of the centerpiece of my style. It really resonated with me. That you are no better than anybody else, but nobody's better than you. So treat people with respect, and I always did that. And then my dad said, "Look, never be afraid to try to be the best." And that instilled in me the desire for my organization, whatever organization I was in, to be the best at whatever it was doing.
Mm-hmm. And to not be afraid to go for it.
Yeah. I mean, every organization I was part of, I wanted them to be considered the best at whatever it was that we were doing.
Yeah.
Like that first platoon.
Yeah.
And I was willing to work to do that. And it didn't always work out.
Yeah.
It didn't always happen.
But when you have that mindset, that sort of clears your path a little bit. It clears your mental path.
Sure.
Knowing that that's all you need to focus on.
There was something about it. It was try to be the best.
Yeah.
Because that said, it ain't always going to work out.
Try is the key word there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Go for it.
Yeah.
You're not always going to make it, but go for it. And that's true.
Right. There's nothing to lose by trying. You'll be forced to rise to the occasion.
Look at all the folks you talk to. I mean, you're going to ask them, what was was it you failed at that made you the best? I mean, look at Steve Jobs. I mean, he got booted, came back, saved the company, and changed about 9 different industries.
Thank you for bringing up the question. Were there any times where you felt like you fell short?
Yeah, it's interesting.
Or I guess, how did you get up when you felt like you made a mistake?
I think the first thing, and for some reason this came easy to me.
Mm.
Once I realized I made a mistake, I usually said so pretty quick.
Yeah.
And getting on with things comes from admitting that you'd screwed something up.
Yeah.
And sometimes it took me a little longer to get to that than others, but I was pretty candid. I was always pretty candid.
Yeah.
And I was pretty comfortable in my own skin. Mm-hmm. And so I knew I wasn't a perfect person. And so it wasn't easy for me to say, hey, I screwed this up, especially to my boss. Especially after you've done it a couple of times. I say, hey, we've got a pattern here, Casey, but that gets back to the character.
Yeah.
So accepting the fact that you screwed something up is a start. I think I had all I ever wanted to be when I first came in the Army was a good battalion commander. After my first job, I wanted to be a good battalion commander. So that's lieutenant colonel, and that's about 15 to 20 years in your service, that's about when you get it. And so I worked very hard to prepare myself to do that. Because of that, I was so focused on that, I didn't really pay attention to a lot of other career-enhancing things and other jobs. And so when I finished my battalion command, I thought I did terrific.
Yeah.
And I was very pleased with what I did. But then the below the zone promotion, for probably about 1 or 2% of the people get picked below the zone, and I had been picked for major and lieutenant colonel below the zone. So you kind of, even though it's a crapshoot, you kind of expect it. So list comes up, not on it. What happened? Another list comes out. I'm on the list, but it's in the zone. So now I'm back with my contemporaries. Then the brigade command list comes out, and I'm not on that. The colonel command list. And I'm saying, what have I done here? And it was one of those things where I couldn't quite put my finger on it. But what I realized is I didn't know anybody in the Army because I'd stayed at Fort Carson for about 12 years. Yeah. I knew people at Fort Carson, but I didn't know anybody else. And then just this is how it works. I was in the Pentagon. I figured I was done. I had actually signed up for an executive MBA program at George Washington, and I get a call from a 2-star general who I didn't know, asking me if I'd like to interview to be the chief of staff of his division, which just happened to be the 1st Cavalry Division, which my dad was commanding when he was killed. And I said, sure. So I went down and I had a 20-minute interview with the guy. I'd never met him. And about a month later, of course, I'm on pins and needles, and for a month, and he calls, maybe 6 weeks, and he calls me and says, when can you be down here? And I said, whew. And then came out on the brigade command list, finished up there, went to Germany, came out on the brigadier list, and that was it. But I could just as well have been stacking BBs in the Pentagon,
Mm-hmm.
So it was just, there's luck involved.
Yeah. I think that's a good place to end.
There's luck involved. Yeah, good.
Thank you for taking the time.
No, my pleasure.